Elizabeth Keckley made the First Lady of the United States beautiful through a civil war, through two dead sons, through the collapse and rebuilding of a nation. Then she wrote it all down. In 1868, the dressmaker who had stitched Mary Todd Lincoln's most photographed gowns, who had dressed her for an inauguration and comforted her after an assassination, published a memoir meant to defend her closest friend. The book destroyed her instead. By the end of that year, the woman who had made a First Lady beautiful for 8 years had almost no clients left. Mary Lincoln called it betrayal. She never spoke to Elizabeth Keckley again. This was not the first price Elizabeth Keckley paid for her extraordinary life. Decades earlier, long before she ever touched a White House gown, greatness had already taken her freedom, her son, and years of stolen labor from her, and it was not finished collecting. The dresses survived. The friendship didn't. For nearly 100 years, neither did her name. What did it actually cost to make a First Lady beautiful? This is that account. Some women understand cloth. Fewer understand people. Elizabeth Keckley understood both, and she learned the second lesson the hardest way possible. She was born enslaved in February 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, the only child of Agnes Hobbs, an enslaved woman in the household of Armistead Bulwell. Bulwell was also, as Keckley would not learn until she was in her mid-30s, her biological father. She grew up believing her mother's husband, George Pleasant Hobbs, was her father instead, a man she loved and lost early, when his own enslaver forced him west and the family was permitted nothing more than letters between them for the rest of his life. By age 4, Keckley was assisting her mother with the sewing and household labor that would define the next 50 years of her life. She was, by her own account, a nursemaid to Bulwell's grandchildren before she was old enough to understand what enslavement meant for her own future. At 14, she was sent to North Carolina to serve Bulwell's eldest son, Robert, and his new wife, a woman who found Keckley's presence, and possibly her resemblance to Robert, deeply unsettling. For 4 years, the household arranged for a local schoolmaster to beat her in an effort to break what they called her stubborn pride. She resisted, physically and morally, for as long as resistance was possible. During the same period in Hillsborough, a white merchant named Alexander Kirkland began a pattern of sexual assault against her that continued for 4 years. In 1839 or 1841, sources place her son's birth in different years. Keckley gave birth to a son. She named him George, after the stepfather she had lost. This is not a detour from the story of her gift. It is the forge that made it. Everything Keckley would later be celebrated for, her composure under pressure, her instinct for what a woman needed before that woman knew how to ask for it, her ability to hold other people's fear and grief without visibly breaking, had already been built, brutally, before she ever picked up a needle for pay. She had learned to read a room because her survival depended on reading it correctly. She had learned to manage volatile, powerful people because she had spent her entire childhood as property of exactly that kind of person. By her 20s, reunited with her mother and relocated again, this time to St. Louis with the Garland family, who had married into the Bulwells, Keckley turned that same discipline toward dressmaking. The Garlands were struggling financially, supporting a household of 17 people on dwindling means. Keckley proposed hiring herself out as a seamstress rather than let her aging mother be sent to work in other households. The family agreed. Within a short time, her sewing alone was supporting all 17 of them. She became, by every surviving account, one of the finest dressmakers in the city, sought after by St. Louis's wealthiest women, all while every dollar she earned belonged, by law, to someone else. In 1852, after years of asking, Hugh Garland finally agreed to a price for Keckley's freedom and her son's, $1,200. It would take her 3 more years to raise it, in part with a loan from her patron and friend Elizabeth LeBourgeois, who collected contributions from Keckley's own client base. On November 15, 1855, Anne Garland signed the papers. Keckley later wrote that the world itself seemed to change color, the very stars seemed to sing with joy. She stayed innocent. Louis 5 more years, working to repay every dollar of that loan before she considered herself truly free. Then, in 1860, she left for Washington, D.C., a city with strict legal barriers for free black residents, but also a fast-growing community of free and formerly enslaved African Americans, and a political elite whose wives needed to look exactly right in a capital where appearance was currency. She needed a license simply to reside there. A client helped secure it. Then she began building a list that would soon include the most powerful women in the country. Adele Cutts Douglas, wife of Senator Stephen Douglas, commissioned an entire spring wardrobe finished in under a week. Mary Anna Custis Lee, wife of Robert E. Lee, became a client. So did Varina Davis, wife of the Mississippi senator soon to lead the Confederacy. An 1862 newspaper profile, written at the height of her reputation, called her a stately, stylish woman and an artist, noting that outside her workroom, the haughty carriages of Washington's elite waited in line while inside, their owners sat docile as lambs while she told them what to wear. Read that sentence again. Docile as lambs. These were women who commanded every other room they entered. In Elizabeth Keckley's workroom, they deferred to her. She had not yet reached the White House. She had already proven, to the most powerful women in Washington, that her eye was more reliable than their own. On March 5, 1861, the day after Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration, Mary Todd Lincoln hired Elizabeth Keckley as her personal dressmaker. The introduction came through a client. Following a small crisis, a dress the new First Lady needed was unfinished, and Mary Lincoln was not a woman inclined to absorb inconvenience quietly. Keckley arrived, salvaged the gown, and made it work. That night, the president reportedly told his wife she looked charming, adding that Mrs. Keckley had met with great success. It was the beginning of something far larger than a single commission. Over that spring, Keckley made 15 or 16 dresses for the First Lady, precision work delivered under constant public scrutiny, in a city where the press printed opinions on everything Mary Lincoln wore. Getting it right mattered enormously, and Keckley got it right, consistently. The relationship deepened fast. Within months she was not only the dressmaker but the dresser, the traveling companion, and, increasingly, the one person Mary Lincoln trusted without reservation. The president himself reportedly took to addressing her as Madam Elizabeth. The First Lady called her Lizabeth. She had, Keckley later wrote, simply dropped the E. Mary Lincoln needed that trust more than most First Ladies before her. An outsider to Washington's old political families, anxious about her standing, and, as she confided to almost no one but Keckley, quietly accumulating a personal debt that would eventually reach $27,000, an enormous sum for the era. She leaned on Keckley for counsel that went far beyond fabric, state dinners, campaign strategy, the management of her own reputation. The business grew alongside the commission. By 1865, tax records show Keckley's Washington workshop employing up to 25 seamstresses and generating serious profit. New clients arrived on the strength of one fact: to dress Mary Todd Lincoln was to hold the single most visible position available to any dressmaker in the country. And Keckley used that visibility for something larger than dresses. When the Civil War began flooding Washington with formerly enslaved people who had fled north with nothing, she recognized a need she was uniquely positioned to meet. In August 1862, with 40 other members of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, she founded the Contraband Relief Association, an organization providing food, clothing, and shelter to refugees arriving in the capital. She became its president. She recruited Frederick Douglass to lecture on its behalf. She persuaded the white abolitionist Wendell Phillips to lend his name to it. She traveled to New York and Boston with Mary Lincoln to raise money directly. The association's annual receipts grew from $838 to over $1,200 within a year. Her access reached further still. Keckley arranged a meeting between President Lincoln and Sojourner Truth. She accompanied the presidential party to Richmond and Petersburg after the Confederate capital fell to Union forces. She was inside the White House, listening, when Lincoln delivered his final public speech before his assassination. 3 years after arriving in Washington with almost nothing, Keckley ran a business, employed a staff, dressed a first lady, held the ear of a president, and led an organization feeding hundreds of the capital's most vulnerable people. She had built exactly what she set out to build. The bill for building it had already started arriving. It did not arrive as a single event. It arrived the way most invisible costs do, gradually, in the accumulation of demands that had nothing to do with sewing at all. Mary Todd Lincoln was, by nearly every account, an exhausting woman to serve. Brilliant and generous 1 hour, seized by what her husband called her attacks, spells of anxiety and despair, the next. Keckley absorbed all of it. She arrived when summoned, regardless of what her own workshop needed that day. She soothed moods the rest of the White House staff found unmanageable. She became, in effect, on call to the whole person, not merely the clothed one. This was not incidental to the job. It was the job. And availability at that level carries a cost no commission receipt ever records. The arrangement had a clear logic. Mary Lincoln's patronage was the thing that made everything else possible, the other clients, the standing, the access to a president. Keckley was not naive about the trade she had made. But understanding a trade does not make you immune to its price. And the first installment had already been paid, in a currency far more permanent than time. In April 1861, 1 month after Keckley began dressing the First Lady, her son George enlisted in a Missouri Unionist militia. George Kirkland was, by every account, more than 3/4 white by descent, a fact the United States Army of 1861 found legally decisive, since black men were barred from enlisting. So George enlisted as a white man. He used his father's surname, not his mother's. He had spent time at Wilberforce University in Ohio, the school his mother had sent him to in 1860, before he chose the battlefield instead. He joined the 1st Missouri Volunteers. On August 10, 1861, his first engagement, at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, George was killed. He was barely into his 20s. He was Elizabeth Keckley's only child, the son she had spent years buying free alongside herself. This is the first cost the historical record makes unmistakable, not a compromise, not a professional trade-off, but the death of the child whose freedom she had purchased with her own hands. She received the news at the exact moment her career was breaking open, new clients arriving weekly, a business expanding, a first lady beginning to depend on her completely. There is no record of her setting any of it down. She kept sewing, kept managing her staff, kept building the relief organization that would soon carry her leadership into rooms far beyond a workshop. In her own memoir, she wrote only sparingly of George's death, devoting far more space to Willie Lincoln's, a silence some historians read as its own kind of testimony. Some losses, carried by a woman with no permission to fall apart publicly, simply do not make it onto the page. There was another loss folded into this same period, quieter and slower moving. Incent. Louis Keckley had renewed an acquaintance with James Keckley, a man she had known back in Virginia. He told her he was free. She agreed to marry him in 1852. On one condition, that he help persuade Hugh Garland to allow her and George to purchase their freedom. He did. But the marriage itself soured quickly. Keckley eventually discovered that James was very likely a fugitive from enslavement himself, not the free man he had claimed to be, and that far from being a source of support, he had become someone she was, in practice, supporting. The couple formally separated by 1860, the same year she left for Washington alone with her son. A husband's deception. A son's death. A friend's grief absorbed as her own, night after night, while her business ran on the labor of 25 women she still had to manage and pay. 6 months after George's death, In February 1862, Mary Lincoln's 11-year-old son Willie died of typhoid fever inside the White House. The First Lady's grief was, by every account, nearly incapacitating. Her sister came, stayed briefly, and left. When she left, Mary Lincoln asked for Keckley. "If it had not been for Lizzie Keckley, I do not know what I should have done," Mary Lincoln wrote to her husband that spring. Two women who had each buried a son within the same year, one to a war, one to illness, found something in each other's company that required no explanation. Keckley was asked to travel with the First Lady, to sit through her worst nights, to be present in a way that pulled her away from her own workshop for days at a time. She did not decline. She went where she was needed. She always had. Consider, plainly, what this required of her in practice. While running a staff of 25 seamstresses, fulfilling the commissions that kept her business solvent, and organizing a relief fund supporting hundreds of displaced people, Elizabeth Keckley was also sitting beside a grieving First Lady through the acute agony of losing a child, a grief she herself had not been permitted the luxury of sitting with. None of this second role appeared in a ledger. None of it was compensated the way a gown was compensated. This was intimate labor, presence, stability, emotional weight-bearing, of a kind that has always gone unrecognized in the women who provide it, and doubly so when a black woman provides it to a white woman of far greater social standing. Keckley was indispensable in a way that gave her no formal protection and no right of refusal. It was, in the largest sense, familiar ground. She had spent her childhood being sent wherever she was needed and reorganizing her own life around whoever needed her there. She had learned early that the interior lives of enslaved women were not welcome in the rooms where decisions were made. The composure that now made her so valuable to a grieving First Lady was the same composure she had built, out of necessity, over 3 decades of carrying loss in silence. The skill and the wound, in her, were the same instrument. There is a question historians still ask about why Elizabeth Keckley wrote her memoir. Her critics, and there were many, answered it simply: a servant had exceeded the boundaries of her station, a black woman had presumed to make the private lives of white elites into material for her own literary gain. The record tells a more complicated story. In September 1866, a year and a half after Lincoln's assassination, Mary Lincoln, now in Chicago, deep in debt, desperate for money, wrote to Keckley and asked her to come to New York. The plan was quiet: sell off the former First Lady's wardrobe, discreetly, to raise cash. Keckley agreed to help, traveling to New York to manage negotiations with a broker on Mary Lincoln's behalf. The plan did not stay quiet. Newspapers discovered the sale almost immediately and were merciless. Harper's Weekly ran an illustration of the exhibited wardrobe, framed as a spectacle of poor taste. The clothes did not sell. Mary Lincoln retreated to Chicago, leaving Keckley in New York to face the wreckage, and the reporters, alone. It was there, in the fallout of a plan she had not designed, that Keckley made her decision. She began writing. Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, was published in 1868. Part of its purpose, by Keckley's own account, was to defend Mary Lincoln, to offer a sympathetic portrait of a woman being publicly mocked and humiliated for the old clothes affair. It was also something larger, a slave narrative, an account of survival, purchased freedom, and what freedom had and had not made possible. In a single volume, it held both a nation's wound and one woman's answer to it. The public did not read it that way. Keckley's editor, James Redpath, had access to a trove of Mary Lincoln's private letters entrusted to him for background and context. He published many of them as an appendix to the book, a decision that would define the scandal far more than anything Keckley herself had written. The press condemned her not for what was false, but for what was true, and for what her editor had chosen to attach to it without her full understanding of the consequences. Critics argued that a domestic servant, particularly a formerly enslaved one, had no right to turn her employer's private correspondence into public material, regardless of accuracy, regardless of intent. Keckley, in a letter to her publisher, asked the obvious question back, whether she was being condemned because my skin is dark and I was once a slave. No one on the other side of that argument offered an honest answer. If this story is holding your attention, the channel has many more like it worth your time. Robert Todd Lincoln reportedly worked to suppress the book's circulation. Mary Lincoln, who had once called Keckley her best living friend, who had asked for her by name in the hours after her husband's assassination, who had leaned on her through the deaths of 2 children and years of White House pressure, dismissed her publicly as the colored historian and never spoke to her again. The 2 women who had shared some of the most private grief of the Lincoln era never exchanged another word. Keckley's clients disappeared within the season. White Washington withdrew almost entirely. Women who had once sat docile as lambs in her workroom, trusting her eye over their own, stopped coming. Many never returned, because the book had reminded them, uncomfortably, that the women managing their households were watching, remembering, and capable of writing it all down. She had written the book to defend a friend. She lost the friend, the clients, and a decade of professional standing in a single publishing season. Elizabeth Keckley kept working. The business was diminished, not gone. She still had the skill the trained eye no scandal could take back. She trained young black seamstresses in the craft that had once purchased her own freedom. She kept a fraction of her old client list. She continued, because continuing was, in her life, the only direction that had ever been available to her. But something had also shifted. The book that ended her business had made her legible to history in a way no dress commission ever could. She was now not only the woman who had clothed a first lady, but one of the first White House insiders to leave behind a written record of what that life actually looked like from the inside. Historians would eventually rely on behind the scenes extensively for details about Mary Lincoln's grief, her debts, her marriage, details no one else was positioned to record. The book that destroyed her reputation became, in time, primary source material for generations of Lincoln scholarship. She did not live to see that reversal recognized. At some point in the late 1870s or 1880s, she sold 26 personal keepsakes Mary Lincoln had given her over the years, small mementos of a friendship that had ended in total silence. She sold them for $250. 2 decades of intimacy, liquidated at the end of a life for a few $100s. There is a bitter irony worth naming here. The very wardrobe mocked as vulgar in the 1867 old clothes scandal, the gowns newspapers ridiculed as improper to even auction, now hang in museum collections, studied by fashion historians as significant American artifacts. What the public called unseemly in 1867 became archival within a few generations. Keckley did not live to benefit, materially or otherwise, from that reversal. In 1892, Wilberforce University in Ohio, the same historically black institution her son had once attended, and the first private HBCU in the country, offered her a faculty position leading its Department of Sewing and Domestic Science Arts. She accepted. It suited exactly what she had always been, a craftsman who passed her knowledge forward. In 1893, she organized a dress exhibit from Wilberforce at the Chicago World's Fair. For a moment, her work was visible on a national stage again, not as a scandal, but as scholarship. Then she suffered a stroke, resigned her position, and returned to Washington. She lived out her final years on her son's Civil War survivor pension, $8 a month, later raised to $12. Establishing that pension had required proving George's identity to the Army, a bureaucratic irony of its own. A man who had enlisted as white existed, in the military's own records, as white. The pension was eventually granted, with help from allies including the abolitionist Lovejoy brothers. It became her only income. In her last years, she moved into the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children, an institution that had grown, indirectly, out of the same relief network she had founded during the war. She had once organized care for people with nothing. She ended her life among them. She died in May 1907 at 89 years old. She was buried at Harmony Cemetery in Washington, beneath a mammoth elm tree, on what one later chronicler called a beautiful knoll facing east. Even her grave could not hold her name in peace. She had signed her legal documents Keckley. Her memoir had been published under Keckley, with an extra E that would follow her, misremembered, for 100 years. By 1935, a journalist went further than misspelling. He publicly claimed that Elizabeth Keckley had never existed at all, that behind the scenes was a fabrication with no author behind it. It took an amateur historian, John E. Washington, gathering testimony from people who had personally known her, to prove the obvious, that she had been real, that she had lived exactly the life the book described, and that history's confusion about her name reflected nothing about her except how little care had been taken to remember it correctly. The White House survived her. The dresses survived her. The memoir, the relief organization she founded, all of it outlasted her by decades. So did the name most people still associated with the gowns she made, the history she preserved, and the grief she carried for others as well as her own. That name was Mary Todd Lincoln. A purple velvet gown sits today in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, worn by Mary Todd Lincoln during the 1861-62 social season, its lines restrained and modern against the ornate excess of the period. Elizabeth Keckley made it. A green and white plaid day dress survives at the Chicago History Museum. A black silk gown with a strawberry motif survives at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. A handful of other attributed pieces have survived a century and a half, with varying degrees of documentary certainty. There is a quiet irony in even that certainty. Dress historians note that the period predated the kind of labeling that would have definitively identified a garment's maker. Most of what is attributed to Keckley is reconstructed from the testimony of the women who wore her clothes, from family records, from stylistic analysis, the same inferential evidence that has always shadowed the historical recovery of women's labor. The woman who made a First Lady's most photographed gowns left almost no paper trail attached to the gowns themselves. Her name had to be rebuilt from other people's records, piece by piece, the same way it had once been rebuilt from newspaper columns and pension files, and later from a skeptical journalist's false claim that she had never existed at all. What survives of her work shares a distinct character. Fashion historian Elizabeth Way has pointed to its clean lines and unpretentious geometry, a boldness that reads, even now, as strikingly modern against the lavish fashions of the 1860s. Keckley was working at the leading edge of a restrained American aesthetic that wouldn't be fully articulated for decades. The simplicity was not a limitation. It was a conviction. It was hers. What she may not have seen, or saw clearly and chose anyway, was the account accumulating behind her. She was born into a ledger she had no hand in writing, the daughter of an enslaved woman and the man who enslaved that woman, a childhood marked by violence she did not choose and a son conceived through assault she did not consent to. She spent 30 years turning a skill she was never credited for into the means of buying herself out of that ledger entirely. Then, within roughly a decade, she built something extraordinary. She dressed the First Lady of the United States through a civil war. She stood inside the White House the morning after a presidential assassination because the First Lady asked for her by name. She founded an organization that carried hundreds of displaced people through the chaos of emancipation. She wrote a book that, for all it cost her, remains one of the most valuable first-hand records of the Lincoln White House in existence. The other side of that ledger is just as long. She buried her only child in his first battle under a name that was not fully his own, because the country he died for would not let him die as himself. She endured a husband's deception and separated from him rather than build a life on a lie. She kept working through every loss without pause. She watched a 4-year intimacy dissolve in a single publishing season, ended by the act of telling the truth. She lost her clients, her income, and 20 years of professional standing almost overnight. She taught until a stroke made teaching impossible, then came home to spend her final years inside an institution she had, in a different life, helped build the foundation for. Even her name was nearly erased twice, once by neglect, once by a stranger's outright denial that she had ever lived. When she asked her publisher in writing whether she was condemned because my skin is dark and I was once a slave, the question was not rhetorical. It was documentary. It was, in its own way, the same work she had always done, observing precisely what was in front of her, and setting it down. History has, slowly, begun to answer her back. In 2012, Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln placed her on screen, portrayed by Gloria Reuben, in front of audiences who had never heard her name. Novelists and playwrights followed. In 2018, the New York Times included her in its Overlooked No More series, obituaries for historical figures the paper had failed to acknowledge at the time of their deaths, more than a century late. Scholars have since collected her writing and correspondence into dedicated academic volumes, restoring, piece by piece, the record that neglect and a false 1935 accusation had both tried to erase. The dresses are still studied for what they reveal about the birth of American design. The memoir is still used by historians for what it reveals about a presidential family under siege. The relief network she founded seeded institutions that outlived her by generations. For most of the 20th century, she was remembered, if she was remembered at all, as the First Lady's dressmaker. That is the account. On one side, the artistry, the endurance, the books and institutions that quietly outlasted her. On the other, a name entered into a household ledger at birth. A son buried under someone else's surname. A husband's deception. A friendship ended by an act of honesty. A final address in a home for the destitute and a stranger's claim, decades later, that she had never lived at all. The purple velvet gown still exists, climate-controlled, catalogued, admired. The woman who made it was found, in 1907, among the forgotten. History kept what she built. It never finished counting what building it cost her.